Norman Tuttle, an 87-year-old retired librarian with a knack for bad jokes and mismatched socks, finally arrives at the Great Wall of China, his lifelong dream. Grumbling about his sore knees while snapping selfies with tourists, Norman accidentally stumbles onto a loose brick. Curious, he leans down, muttering, "Wouldn't it be funny if I found treasure instead of arthritis?" The brick shifts, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lies a glowing orb, pulsing like it's alive. Norman Tuttle had never imagined that his retirement would end with him wobbling on creaky knees at the foot of the Great Wall of China. Yet here he was, squinting up at the ancient marvel as if it were personally mocking his arthritis. The decision to embark on this journey had come after a rather melodramatic conversation with his doctor. "Norman," the doctor had said, "you've got 6 months, maybe less. It's time to check things off your bucket list." "You mean like polishing off a 12-inch pizza in one sitting?" Norman had quipped, earning a sigh from the doctor. But the truth was, Norman had only one true wish: to see the Great Wall of China, the place he had read about 1,000,000 times but never dared to visit. Not because of fear, he just couldn't justify spending the money on himself. His nurse and travel companion, Lila Montgomery, was the one who finally convinced him. "Norman," she said with a warm smile, "it's now or never. Besides, I've got a craving for Chinese food." Lila had been a godsend since his diagnosis. Patient, kind, and with just the right amount of sass to keep up with Norman's constant sarcasm. At 33, she had the energy Norman lacked, and he often joked that she was his unpaid bodyguard. But even she had her limits. The flight to Beijing had been nothing short of a disaster. Norman spent the 13-hour ordeal bickering with the passenger next to him about armrest etiquette and complaining about the airline food. "This isn't chicken," he declared, poking at the unidentifiable lump on his tray. "It's revenge." By the time they landed, Lila was already regretting her life choices. But Norman, he was exhilarated. The air in Beijing felt electric to him even though it was heavy with smog. Their tour guide, a young man named Wei, greeted them at the airport with a sign that read, "Welcome, Mr. Turtle." Norman laughed so hard he nearly dropped his cane. "It's Tuttle," he corrected. "But Turtle works too. I'm about as fast as one these days." The drive to the Great Wall was a blur of honking cars, crowded streets, and Norman's running commentary about everything from the architecture to the street food vendors. When they finally arrived, he stepped out of the van and froze. It was breathtaking. The wall stretched endlessly, a serpent of stone winding through the hills. For a moment, Norman forgot about his aching joints and just stared. "All right, old man," Lila said, nudging him. "Let's get climbing." "I thought we'd start with a leisurely stroll," Norman replied, eyeing the steep steps. "Didn't realize we'd need mountaineering gear." The first few steps were easy enough, but as they ascended, Norman's knees began to protest. "You know," he huffed, "they really should install escalators on this thing." "Ah," Lila rolled her eyes. "You're doing great. Just think of it as burning off that airline food." When they reached a flat section of the wall, Norman plopped down on a bench, pulling out a small notebook. He'd brought it to jot down his thoughts, but instead, he began sketching the wall. It wasn't a masterpiece, more like a child's drawing, but it captured the moment. "I used to sketch a lot," he told Lila, "before life got in the way. Now I've got nothing but time." Lila smiled, but didn't reply. She knew Norman wasn't one for heart-to-heart conversations, but she appreciated the rare glimpse into his softer side. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the wall, Norman stood and stretched. "All right, let's keep going. Can't let the Great Wall win." They continued their climb, stopping occasionally for Norman to catch his breath or tell a joke. When they reached a particularly scenic spot, Norman insisted on taking a selfie. "Smile," he said, holding up his phone. But just as he snapped the photo, he stumbled, his foot catching on a loose brick. He fell forward, his hands landing on the stone floor with a thud. "You okay?" Lila asked, rushing to help him up. Norman waved her off. "I'm fine, just old and clumsy." But as he stood, he noticed something odd. The brick he'd tripped on wasn't just loose, it was hollow underneath. He crouched down, wincing as his knees protested, and pried it open. "What are you doing?" Lila asked, peering over his shoulder. "Wouldn't it be funny if I found treasure instead of arthritis?" Norman joked, but when he pulled the brick free, his humor vanished. Inside the hidden compartment was a small, glowing orb. It pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. "What is that?" Lila whispered. "No idea," Norman replied, his voice unusually serious. He reached out to touch it, and the moment his fingers made contact, a strange warmth spread through his body. Symbols he couldn't understand flashed before his eyes, and for a brief moment he felt weightless. Then everything went dark. When Norman woke up, Lila was shaking him. "Norman, are you okay? You passed out." He groaned, sitting up slowly. "I'm fine," he muttered. But as he looked down at his hand, he saw a strange mark glowing faintly on his palm. It looked like an ancient symbol, but it faded before he could make sense of it. Lila helped him to his feet. "Maybe we should head back." Norman shook his head. "Not yet, I think we've just started an adventure." Norman Tuttle was not a man easily rattled, but something about the glowing orb felt off. As he and Lila descended the Great Wall, every step felt heavier, as if the artifact in his backpack was weighing him down. "Norman," Lila began, breaking the silence, "are you going to tell me what that thing is, or should we just assume it's an alien egg?" Norman smirked. "If it hatches, I'm naming it after you." Despite his humor, Norman couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The shadows stretched unnaturally as the sun dipped below the horizon, and every sound felt amplified. By the time they reached the bottom of the wall, their guide Wei was waiting with a worried expression. "You took long time," he said, glancing at the fading light. "Night here is not safe." "Oh, don't worry about me," Norman quipped. "I'm great at running away from danger, very slowly." Wei didn't laugh. "You should leave now. Quickly." Before Norman could ask what he meant, a loud crack echoed from the woods nearby. Lila grabbed his arm. "What was that?" "Probably a deer," Norman said, though he didn't believe it. Wei shook his head. "Not deer. Come, van is this way." The trees seemed unnaturally still as they hurried to the van. When they finally reached it, Wei slammed the doors shut and drove off at breakneck speed. "You want to explain what's going on?" Lila asked, her voice sharp. Wei hesitated. "The wall. It is old, full of stories. Some good, some bad. You should not touch things that do not belong to you." "Well, too late for that," Norman muttered. They reached their hotel without incident, but Norman's unease hadn't subsided. That night, as he sat on the edge of his bed examining the strange mark on his palm, he noticed it glowed faintly in the dark, pulsing with his heartbeat. "Norman, you okay?" Lila called from the adjoining room. "Fine," he lied, quickly covering his hand. Sleep didn't come easily. His dreams were filled with images of warriors and a voice whispering in a language he couldn't understand. He woke, drenched in sweat, the mark on his palm glowing brighter than before. The next morning, Lila cornered him at breakfast. "All right, spill. What's going on with you?" Norman hesitated. "I think this thing might be important." "No kidding," Lila said. "It glows, Norman. Things that glow are either radioactive or magical, and I'm betting on the latter." "Magical? Really?" Norman said. "Next you'll tell me I'm some kind of chosen one." "Don't flatter yourself," Lila shot back, "but seriously, we need to figure out what that thing is." Their conversation was interrupted by Wei, who approached their table looking pale. "You must leave. Now." "What? Why?" Norman asked, his fork halfway to his mouth. "There are people looking for you," Wei whispered. "Bad people. They know about the artifact." Lila's face hardened. How? Wei glanced around nervously. The wall has eyes. That's comforting, Norman muttered, shoving the last piece of toast into his mouth. Within an hour, they were back on the road, heading toward a remote monastery Wei claimed could help. The monks there know many things, he explained. If anyone can tell you what that artifact is, it is them. The drive was tense. Lila kept one hand on her phone, while Norman stared out the window, lost in thought. As they neared the monastery, the air seemed heavier, charged with energy Norman couldn't describe. The building itself was ancient, its stone walls covered in moss and carvings of mythical creatures. An elderly monk greeted them at the gate. He looked at Norman, his eyes lingering on the backpack. "You carry great burden," he said. "Tell me about it," Norman replied. The monk led them inside where they sat in a dimly lit room. Norman placed the orb on the table and the monk studied it for a long time. "This is the heart of Longwei," he finally said. "Sounds like a Chinese restaurant," Norman joked, earning a glare from Lila. The monk ignored him. "It is an artifact of great power, created centuries ago to protect balance. In the wrong hands, it could bring destruction." "Of course it could," Norman muttered. "Why can't it ever be something simple, like a lucky charm?" The monk's expression didn't change. "The guardians will come for it. They seek to use its power to awaken an ancient evil." Lila leaned forward. "Guardians? Who are they?" "Servants of darkness," the monk said. "They have waited centuries for the heart to resurface. Now that it has, they will stop at nothing." "Well, that's great," Norman said. "So, what do we do?" The monk placed a hand on Norman's shoulder. "You must protect it. The heart chose you." "Me?" Norman exclaimed. "I'm an old man with bad knees. Why would it choose me?" "Because," the monk said, "you have something they do not, a pure heart." Norman stared at him, speechless for once. Pure heart? Him? The same man who once cheated in a bingo game? Before he could argue, the doors burst open and a gust of wind extinguished the candles. From the shadows emerged several hooded figures, their eyes glowing faintly. "The guardians," the monk whispered. Norman gulped. "Oh, fantastic! I was just starting to enjoy my retirement." Lila grabbed his arm. "Time to run, old man." As the figures advanced, Norman clutched the orb tightly. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. His life was about to get a lot more complicated. The night air was cold and sharp as Norman and Lila ran, the flickering light of the monastery behind them. The guardians were in pursuit, their low whispers echoing in the dark. Norman clutched the glowing orb, his knees protesting with every step. "This was not how I imagined going out," Norman wheezed, glancing back. "I was hoping for something dignified, like choking on a cheeseburger." Lila grabbed his arm. Less talking, more running. The monk stayed behind to hold off the guardians, his calm demeanor masking desperation. Norman caught a glimpse of him drawing a shimmering staff before the doors slammed shut. He wanted to help, but knew he'd only get in the way. "Where are we even going?" Norman gasped. "To the van," Lila replied. "Unless you've got a better idea?" "Does it involve sitting?" The van was parked just outside the monastery gates, but the guardians were gaining on them. Their glowing eyes and shadow-like forms flickered unnaturally. As Lila fumbled with the keys, Norman turned to face the pursuers, gripping the orb like a shield. "I don't suppose we can talk this out," he muttered. One guardian stepped forward, its hood falling back to reveal a face that wasn't human. Pale, sharp features and glowing white eyes locked onto him. It extended a skeletal hand, and Norman felt a compulsion to obey, to surrender the orb. "Norman, don't!" Lila shouted, snapping him out of the trance. She shoved him into the passenger seat and started the van just as the first guardian lunged. The tires screeched as Lila floored the gas pedal. The van swerved down the narrow mountain road, barely avoiding a steep drop. Norman clung to the orb and his seatbelt, his heart pounding. "Did you see that thing?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It looked like my tax accountant, only scarier." "They're still following us!" Lila shouted, glancing in the mirror. The Guardians were leaping across the terrain with impossible speed, their forms flickering. Norman glanced at the orb, its glow steady and warm. "This thing better be worth it," he muttered. After what felt like hours, the Guardians finally faded from view as they reached a small town. Lila pulled into a deserted lot and killed the engine. Both sat in silence, catching their breath. "Okay," Lila said. "We need a plan." Norman held up the orb. "Step 1. Figure out what this thing does. Step 2. Don't die." "Great plan," Lila said dryly. "Let's start with step 1. The orb seemed to pulse in response, its glow intensifying. Norman frowned, holding it up. "It's warm, like it's alive." "What if it is?" Lila asked. "The monk said it was the heart of Longway. Maybe it's more than an artifact." "Fantastic," Norman muttered. "I've stolen a sentient nightlight." The orb emitted a soft hum, and glowing symbols appeared on its surface before fading. Norman and Lila exchanged a look. "Did you see that?" Norman asked. "Yeah," Lila replied, "and I don't like it." The hum grew louder, and suddenly a beam of light shot out, forming a shimmering map in midair. At its center was a pulsing red dot. "Is that a map?" Lila asked. "Looks like it," Norman said. "But a map to what?" The orb didn't answer, but the red dot pulsed steadily, as if urging them onward. Norman sighed. "Well, I guess we know where we're going next." "Are you sure about this?" Lila asked. "It could be a trap." "Probably," Norman said, "but sitting here won't solve anything." Reluctantly, Lila started the van again, and they followed the map. The road wound through forests and barren hills, the unease growing with each mile. The orb's glow intensified as they approached their destination, an abandoned temple overgrown with vines. Its crumbling facade loomed ominously. "This screams bad idea," Lila said, parking the van. "Agreed," Norman said, stepping out. "But when has that stopped us?" Inside, the orb illuminated carvings on the walls. They depicted glowing warriors battling shadowy figures. "This doesn't look good," Lila said, her voice echoing. Norman approached a pedestal with a glowing symbol. The orb seemed to react, its light syncing with the symbol. "I think it wants me to put it here," Norman said. "Or it wants to blow us up," Lila countered. Norman hesitated, then placed the orb on the pedestal. The room shook as the carvings came to life, swirling in a display of light and shadow. "What did you do?" Lila shouted. "I don't know," Norman said, "but I think we activated something." The light formed a spectral warrior in glowing armor. It looked at Norman and spoke in a deep voice. "You are the keeper. The heart chose you to stand against the darkness." "Great," Norman muttered. "No pressure." The warrior extended a hand, and energy surged through Norman. The mark on his palm flared, and he instinctively understood its meaning. "This is going to get worse, isn't it?" he asked. "Obviously," Lila replied, wide-eyed. The spectral warrior faded, leaving the orb glowing softly. Norman picked it up, its weight feeling heavier than before. "Let's get out of here," he said. Outside, the unease returned, stronger than ever. The Guardians were waiting, and Norman knew their fight was far from over. The tension in the air was thick as Norman and Lila stood outside the temple. The faint glow of the orb illuminated their worried faces. Somewhere in the darkness, the Guardians waited. Norman gripped the orb tightly, his mind racing. "We need a plan," Lila whispered, scanning the shadows. "We can't keep running." "Great," Norman said sarcastically. "What do you suggest? Maybe I can charm them with my sparkling personality?" Before Lila could reply, footsteps echoed through the trees. The Guardians were closing in. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness. Run? Norman asked weakly. No, Lila said, grabbing his arm. We need to fight. With what? My cane. Lila pulled a compact crossbow from her bag. Stay behind me, she said, loading a bolt. Before Norman could argue, the first guardian appeared, skeletal hands outstretched. Lila fired, the bolt striking its chest. It let out a guttural hiss before dissolving into mist. Nice shot, Norman muttered, clutching the orb tighter. More guardians emerged from the shadows. Lila fired again, taking down 2 more, but there were too many. One lunged at her, claws swiping at her shoulder. Norman felt the orb heat up in his hands, the mark on his palm glowing brightly. Instinctively, he raised the orb, and a burst of light exploded from it, engulfing the guardians. When the light faded, the guardians were gone. Norman stood frozen, his hand still glowing faintly. Lila stared at him, lowering her crossbow. What just happened? I think the orb did that, Norman said shakily. Let's hope it works again, Lila muttered. The forest was silent, the air heavy with tension. Even the crickets had stopped chirping, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. We need to leave, Lila said firmly. Norman nodded, and they hurried to the van, the orb lighting their path. Once inside, Lila started the engine and sped off. Norman stared at the orb, his mind racing. What had the monk meant when he called him the keeper? Why had the orb chosen him? Lila broke the silence. We need answers, Norman. That thing isn't just some ancient artifact. It's alive, and it's connected to you. Yeah, I noticed, Norman replied. But how do we figure out what it wants? It's not like it came with instructions. Their argument was cut short by the orb humming softly. The light it emitted formed symbols in the air, glowing briefly before fading into an image of a mountain range with a single red peak glowing at its center. Another map? Lila asked. Looks like it, Norman said, and something tells me we have to follow it. The drive was long, the narrow roads winding through dense forests and barren hills. The orb hummed softly in Norman's lap, its glow providing the only light on the otherwise pitch-black road. Norman couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched, though every time he glanced out the window, the darkness stared back. When they finally reached the base of the mountain, the orb's glow intensified, its hum filling the van. Lila parked the van, and they both stepped out, staring up at the steep climb ahead. This feels like a bad idea, Lila muttered, tightening her grip on the crossbow. When has that ever stopped us? Norman replied, adjusting the strap on his backpack. Let's just get this over with. The climb was brutal, the uneven path barely visible in the faint light of the orb. Norman's knees screamed with every step, and more than once he stumbled, Lila catching him just in time. You okay? She asked, concern etched on her face. Just peachy, Norman grunted. Nothing like a little cardio to spice up a death mission. At the summit, they found a small stone altar, similar to the one in the temple. The orb pulsed in Norman's hand, its glow syncing with carvings on the altar's surface. I guess this is where it wants to go, Norman said, placing the orb on the altar. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a beam of light shot into the sky, illuminating the mountain. Lila shielded her eyes, her grip tightening on the crossbow. What now? She asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the orb. The light coalesced into another spectral figure, this one draped in glowing robes. Its face was obscured, but its presence was commanding. The figure turned to Norman, its voice deep and resonant. The heart has chosen you, it said. You must journey to the final sanctum. There, you will face the darkness and seal it away. Seal it away? Norman repeated, his voice cracking. I'm just an old guy with bad knees. I'm not exactly hero material. The figure's gaze didn't waver. You are the keeper. The heart sees what you cannot. Before Norman could protest, the figure vanished, and the orb floated back into his hands, its glow dimming. The mountain returned to silence. the weight of the figure's words settling heavily on Norman's shoulders. "Well," Lila said, breaking the silence, "I guess we know where we're going next." Norman sighed, slinging the backpack over his shoulder. "And here I thought retirement was supposed to be relaxing." The journey to the final sanctum was anything but straightforward. The map projected by the orb had led them through treacherous terrain, winding paths, and forests that grew darker with every mile. Norman sat in the van, clutching the orb as Lila navigated the narrow roads. "This thing better not lead us off a cliff," Lila muttered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Relax," Norman said, though his voice betrayed unease. "The orb's been reliable so far, aside from making me the world's oldest chosen one." Lila glanced at him. "You realize we're heading straight into danger, right? This isn't a vacation." "Trust me, I'm aware," Norman replied, looking at the glowing orb. "But what choice do we have? If this thing can stop whatever's coming, we have to see it through." The van jolted as the tires hit a pothole, snapping Norman out of his thoughts. "Watch it," he yelped. "Sorry," Lila muttered. "These roads are awful." The forest was eerily silent. The usual sounds of insects and rustling leaves were gone. Norman couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Every shadow seemed alive, making his pulse quicken. The orb's glow brightened, signaling they were close. Lila parked at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley. In the distance, the ruins of an ancient structure rested between jagged peaks. "That must be it," Lila said, shutting off the engine. She grabbed her crossbow. "You ready?" Norman hesitated, staring at the ruins. "Not really," he admitted, "but let's do it anyway." They began the trek down the rocky path, the orb's light casting long shadows. Norman gritted his teeth as his knees protested every step. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. As they neared the ruins, a deep rumble echoed through the valley. Lila froze, raising her crossbow. What was that? The rumble grew louder, and the ground began to quake. Norman clutched the orb as cracks snaked across the earth, spreading toward the ruins. "Okay, not the wind." Before they could react, a massive creature emerged from the shadows, its form shifting like liquid darkness. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and it let out a deafening roar. "Run!" Lila shouted, grabbing Norman's arm and dragging him forward. The creature pursued them relentlessly. Norman could feel its breath on his back, his lungs burning. Lila fired a bolt, but it passed harmlessly through its shadowy form. "It's invincible," she muttered. "Any ideas?" Norman glanced at the orb, now glowing intensely. The mark on his palm flared to life. "I think the orb wants me to use it." "Then do it," Lila yelled. Norman turned to face the beast, raising the orb. A beam of light shot out, striking the creature. It screeched, its form flickering and dissolving into the air. The valley fell silent once more. Norman collapsed to his knees. Layla helped him up, her crossbow still raised. "Are you okay?" "Define okay," he said weakly. The massive stone doors of the ruins loomed before them, etched with intricate carvings. The orb's light revealed symbols similar to those they'd seen at the temple. Norman placed it into a circular slot at the center. The ground trembled and the doors creaked open, revealing a dark corridor. "Ready?" Lila asked. "Nope," Norman replied, stepping through the doorway. "But let's get it over with." The corridor was long, the air heavy with the scent of damp stone. The orb's glow illuminated the path, casting eerie shadows. Norman's heart pounded as they reached a large chamber at the center of the ruins. The room was dominated by a massive pedestal, its surface etched with glowing runes. At its center, a swirling mass of darkness pulsed with malevolent energy. "Is that the darkness?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," Norman said. The mark on his palm burned, and he felt a surge of energy course through him. I think I'm supposed to stop it. The darkness expanded, filling the room with a suffocating presence. The guardians materialized, their glowing eyes fixed on Norman. He raised the orb, its light cutting through the shadows. The darkness recoiled. Norman stepped forward, his determination outweighing his fear. The orb grew heavier in his hands, its glow blinding. The mark on his palm flared, and he felt the energy build to an overwhelming level. "Be careful," Lila called. Norman reached the pedestal and placed the orb on its surface. Light erupted, engulfing the chamber in brilliance. The darkness let out a final, agonized screech before being pulled into the orb, which sealed with a brilliant flash. When the light faded, the chamber was silent. Norman slumped to the ground, exhausted. Lila rushed to his side, helping him up. "Did we do it?" she asked. Norman stared at the now dim orb. "I think so," he said, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." They made their way back through the ruins and into the open air. The valley was quiet, the oppressive presence of the darkness gone. Norman took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "So, what now?" Lila asked as they reached the van. Norman managed a tired smile. "Now, I'm going to take a nap, a very long nap." Lila chuckled, starting the engine. "You earned it, old man." As they drove away, the orb rested quietly in Norman's lap. Its glow was faint but steady, a reminder that while this battle was over, the journey might not be. The ride back to civilization was quiet, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Norman stared at the orb resting in his lap, its glow faint but steady. Lila gripped the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just transpired hanging heavily between them. Finally, Lila broke the silence. "So, what happens now?" Norman sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know. I'm no hero, Lila. I'm just an old guy who wanted to see the Great Wall before he kicked the bucket. Now I'm carrying around some magical artifact that thinks I'm the keeper." He made air quotes with his fingers, then winced as the motion made his shoulder ache. Lila glanced at him briefly, her brow furrowed. "You may not think of yourself as a hero, but that orb chose you for a reason. And let's be honest, you didn't do half bad back there." Norman chuckled dryly. "Yeah, sure. I saved the world, and all it cost me was my dignity, my knees, and what little stamina I had left. I feel like I just ran a marathon while fighting a bear." "You survived," Lila said firmly. "That's more than most people would have managed, and you didn't do it alone." Her tone softened as she added, "You've got me, and we'll figure this out together." Norman offered her a small smile. "Thanks, kid. I don't say it enough, but I couldn't have done any of this without you." Lila smirked. "You're right. You don't say it enough." The orb hummed softly in Norman's lap, drawing their attention. Its glow grew brighter for a moment before dimming again. Norman frowned, running his fingers over its smooth surface. "It's still active," he murmured. "Whatever we did back there, it's not over." "Great," Lila muttered. "I was hoping for a vacation after all this." Norman sighed and leaned back in his seat. "Join the club." The landscape outside the van shifted from barren wilderness to the outskirts of a bustling town. They stopped at a small diner on the edge of the main road, the neon sign flickering in the dim light of dusk. Norman stretched as he climbed out of the van, his joints protesting loudly. "I need coffee," he grumbled, "and maybe a slice of pie, or two." Lila rolled her eyes but followed him inside. The diner was quiet, the kind of place where locals gathered to share gossip over greasy burgers and milkshakes. Norman slid into a booth by the window, while Lila ordered their food at the counter. When she returned, she set a steaming cup of coffee in front of him along with a generous slice of apple pie. "You looked like you needed it," she said, smirking. Norman took a sip of the coffee and sighed in satisfaction. "You're a saint." They ate in companionable silence, the weight of their journey momentarily forgotten. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the diner, the orb began to hum again. Norman and Lila exchanged a wary glance. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is," Lila said. Norman pulled the orb from his bag, its glow illuminating their table. The markings on its surface began to shift, forming new symbols. A beam of light shot out, projecting an image into the air. A map, but not one they recognized. "Not again," Norman groaned. "I thought we were done with this." Lila studied the map, her brow furrowed. "That doesn't look like anywhere around here. Do you think it's showing us somewhere else?" Norman's stomach sank as he realized what she meant. "You're saying it's not over, that there's more out there." "Maybe," Lila said softly. "Or maybe it's trying to tell us something else. Either way, it's not like we can ignore it." Norman rubbed his temples. "I'm too old for this." Lila smirked. "You've already saved the world once. What's one more time?" Norman shot her a look but couldn't suppress a small smile. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "A little," she admitted. "But seriously, Norman, if the orb's still active, it means our job isn't done. We can't just walk away now." Norman stared at the map, the glowing lines shifting and pulsating as if urging him onward. He felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but the heavy realization that his life would never be simple again. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tinged with resignation. "But if we're doing this, I'm going to need more pie, and maybe a nap." Lila laughed, shaking her head. "Deal." They paid their bill and stepped back outside, the cool evening air a stark contrast to the warmth of the diner. Norman glanced up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The orb hummed softly in his hand, its glow steady and reassuring. As they climbed back into the van, Norman couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope amidst the exhaustion. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. He had Lila, the orb, and a purpose, however strange and unwelcome it might be. "You ready?" Lila asked, starting the engine. "Not even a little," Norman replied, buckling his seatbelt. "But let's get it over with." The van rumbled to life, and they set off down the road, the map projected by the orb guiding their way. As they disappeared into the night, the faint glow of the orb illuminated the path ahead, a reminder that their story was far from over.